Tonight, we begin with a development that U.S. intelligence officials, NATO commanders, and European defense ministers had feared, anticipated, and quietly prepared for. A strike that unfolded not over weeks of buildup, but in a matter of hours. Hours that left Ukrainian civilian infrastructure in flames. Hours that tested the resolve of Western alliances. Hours that forced President Biden into the most consequential decision of his final months in office. What Vladimir Putin did today crossed a line that the international community had hoped would hold. And when that line broke, President Zelensky did not hesitate. He responded with clarity, urgency, and a demand that left no room for ambiguity. For several weeks now, there had been signals, not from official Kremlin statements, not from formal diplomatic channels, just whispers from intelligence intercepts, that Putin was preparing something unprecedented. Putin has been aggressive, yes, but he has been calculated in his aggression. His moves have followed a certain rhythm, a pattern, almost a predictability that Western analysts had learned to read. But what set off alarm bells in Washington and Brussels this week was that the pattern went silent. Intelligence analysts who monitor Russian military movements know the indicators. The repositioning of strategic bomber squadrons to forward operating bases. The unusual activity at missile storage facilities in Western Russia. The sudden increase in encrypted communications between military commands. The abrupt cancellation of scheduled military exercises that had been planned for months. All of that went quiet. And whenever Putin goes quiet, it means something is about to get loud. The silence lasted for nearly a week. 7 days of nothing. 7 days where satellite imagery showed equipment moving, but no clear destination. 7 days where diplomatic back channels went cold. Early Thursday morning, Ukrainian time, U.S. surveillance assets detected what they described as a massive coordinated launch sequence, including ballistic missile activity that had not been observed at this scale in over 18 months. These are the kinds of weapons systems that Russia only deploys when they are signaling something very specific: escalation, desperation, or a fundamental shift in military strategy. Western intelligence didn't know which category this fell into, or whether it fell into all three at once. But what they did know was that Putin was changing his military posture dramatically. And when a nuclear-armed adversary shifts posture without explanation, even by a small measure, the Pentagon pays immediate attention. The attack that followed was devastating in both scope and precision. Multiple Ukrainian cities were hit simultaneously in what officials described as the most coordinated strike since the early days of the invasion. Energy infrastructure that had been painstakingly rebuilt over months of international effort was destroyed in minutes. Civilian casualties mounted throughout the morning as rescue workers struggled to reach victims buried under rubble. And President Zelensky, watching his country burn once again, made a decision that would reshape the entire diplomatic landscape. The statement issued by the White House tonight was not normal. It was not routine. It was not symbolic. It was urgent. Official after official in background briefings described Putin's attack as barbaric in its targeting of civilian infrastructure. Calculated in its timing during the American political transition. And perhaps most importantly, a direct challenge to American resolve in the final months of the Biden administration. But intimidation only works if the target hesitates. Zelensky did not. He did not. In fact, his response today was among the most direct and uncompromising we've seen since the war began nearly 3 years ago. Here's what we know. Within 3 hours of the attacks concluding, President Zelensky addressed the Ukrainian parliament in an emergency session and issued what can only be described as an ultimatum to Western allies. These weren't the usual diplomatic requests for continued support wrapped in grateful language. These were specific, actionable demands, weapons systems that Ukraine has been requesting for months, permissions that the Biden administration had been reluctant to grant, and security guarantees that went far beyond anything previously discussed. Zelensky made clear in words that left no room for interpretation. The time for deliberation is over. Tonight, multiple sources confirmed that Zelensky's demands centered on 3 critical areas: expanded long-range strike capabilities with permission to hit targets deep inside Russia, accelerated NATO membership discussions with a concrete timeline, and immediate delivery of advanced air defense systems that had been promised but repeatedly delayed. Zelensky spoke before Putin could frame the attack as a justified response to Western aggression. He addressed the destruction of civilian hospitals that were clearly marked. He addressed the targeting of power plants heading into the brutal Ukrainian winter. He addressed the documented use of North Korean-supplied missiles that intelligence agencies have been tracking for months. In other words, Zelensky targeted the narrative itself. The credibility that Putin has been trying desperately to maintain with wavering international partners, particularly in the global south. This is what made the timing so critical. Putin's attack wasn't just military. It was deeply political. Deeply political. It represented the kind of escalation designed to test whether Western support would finally crack under sustained pressure. And Zelensky, the understanding that calculation fully responded with force, not militarily. He doesn't have that option independently. Not through traditional diplomatic channels. Those move too slowly, but publicly and powerfully. He didn't issue a measured statement through official government channels. He didn't wait for consultations with Western capitals. He went directly to his people first. He went directly to the world second. And then came the surprise that no one in Moscow anticipated. And here's where the story becomes even more significant for understanding what happens next. Administration officials now believe that Putin's latest attack was specifically designed to test the resolve of the Biden administration. After months of political uncertainty and transition planning in Washington, Putin wanted to see whether Biden would hesitate, defer, or delay in his final months. But instead, the exact opposite happened. The White House didn't delay for interagency review. They announced a response that was so swift, so comprehensive, and so clearly coordinated with Zelensky's demands that even Kremlin officials were caught off guard. You don't get Putin's attention easily after nearly 3 years of war, but today, President Biden did. Defense analysts speaking with major news outlets under anonymity described Putin's strategy as probing, a calculated way to identify weaknesses in Western commitment before the presidential transition. But Biden proved today that the administration remains both fully engaged and entirely capable of decisive action. Their response was not only immediate, it was calibrated so precisely that it addressed each of Zelensky's 3 major demands point by point. A point. That specificity matters enormously because it shows coordination at the highest levels. It shows that the White House is not running out the clock on Ukraine. They are running toward the finish line with purpose, as reports continued. Coming in throughout the evening from multiple sources, we learned more about the true scale of Biden's response. The Pentagon announced an additional $2. Fair. $3 billion military aid package, the largest single authorization in months, forcing an immediate scramble at Russian military planning facilities. The State Department confirmed accelerated discussions on NATO membership guarantees that had been deliberately stalled since the summer. Defense officials operating through European Command reportedly authorized the expanded delivery of long-range ATACMS missiles, with fewer restrictions on their use that Ukraine has been requesting since last year. Intelligence sharing protocols were upgraded to provide Ukraine with real-time targeting data previously withheld due to escalation concerns. This wasn't just another routine aid package announced for domestic political consumption. This wasn't just diplomatic signaling designed to look tough without substance. This was a comprehensive, strategic response to a strategic challenge. This was a message delivered in the only language Putin understands. And that message is the one thing Putin has consistently struggled to counter since the invasion began. For every escalation he has attempted, the West has responded with something that complicates his. Remember, Putin thought the West would eventually lose interest as other crises demanded attention. He thought European energy dependence on Russian gas would inevitably fracture the alliance when winter came. He thought American political divisions and the bitter partisanship in Washington would paralyze any meaningful decision-making. But tonight, the exact opposite is happening. NATO is more unified than at any point since the height of the Cold War. European nations are increasing defense spending to historic levels not seen in generations. And an American president, in his final months in office, just authorized one of the most significant military aid packages of the entire conflict. What makes this moment so critical and so revealing about the true state of affairs is that Putin's latest attack happened at a time when he himself is under extraordinary internal pressure. Military hardliners want faster territorial gains to justify the enormous human cost. Economic advisors want any relief from sanctions crushing the Russian economy. Chinese partners want stability and predictability, not continued escalation. Domestic critics, though systematically silenced, want an end to a war with no visible conclusion. Putin is balancing all of these conflicting demands while managing a military campaign that has cost far more in blood and treasure than anyone in Moscow anticipated when tanks first rolled across the border. And when leaders in that precarious position make sudden escalatory moves, they're not doing it from strength. They're doing it from pressure. They're doing it from vulnerability. The White House statement, now being distributed to every major news outlet and diplomatic mission worldwide, was designed to signal unambiguously that the United States is not willing to allow Russia to dictate the terms of this conflict's conclusion. Officials said plainly that Putin's attack was inconsistent with any genuine interest in diplomatic resolution. That is carefully chosen diplomatic language for. We see exactly what you're doing, and we're not backing down. You don't usually hear that tone from the normally cautious Biden administration, unless something genuinely serious is at stake. He said, "We have asked for nothing that we have not earned with the blood of our people and the courage of our defenders." He said, "The world must understand that Ukraine's fight is not Ukraine's alone. It is the fight of every democracy against tyranny." And he said, "Today, we received an answer from our partners, and that answer gives us hope for the winter ahead." These are not rhetorical flourishes designed for international consumption. These are statements from a wartime leader who understands just how high the stakes have become and how narrow the margin for error truly is. Here's what makes the current situation even more concerning for Western planners. Putin's latest attack wasn't isolated or impulsive. Along with the devastating missile strikes, Russian naval forces in the Black Sea significantly increased patrol activity. Near Ukrainian ports, sophisticated cyber attacks targeted Ukrainian government, systems, and financial infrastructure. Belarus announced joint military exercises along the northern border, raising concerns about a potential second front. All of this happened within the same 48-hour period in what appears to be a coordinated pressure campaign. When Putin moves multiple pieces simultaneously across the board, it means something larger is underway, a calculated strategy, not a random escalation. Analysts across Washington and European capitals are now considering several possibilities. One is that Putin is preparing for a major winter offensive designed to break Ukrainian morale before spring. Another is that Putin is attempting to create negotiating leverage before potential peace discussions. A third possibility, the one worrying senior officials the most, is that Putin is attempting to lock in territorial gains before any potential change in American policy. But today, Biden took that calculation completely off the table. He didn't delay for extended consultations with allies. He didn't issue a weak statement expressing concern. He didn't wait for perfect allied consensus. He acted decisively and immediately. What we're watching unfold now is a fundamental test of commitment on all sides. Putin wants to see whether American support has a breaking point he can exploit. Zelensky wants to show that Ukrainian resistance remains unbroken regardless of the cost. European allies want to prevent the dangerous precedent of successful territorial conquest through military force. And the Biden administration wants to prevent history from recording that American leadership wavered when it mattered most tonight. We've heard from intelligence officials who are now actively monitoring Russian command and control facilities for any indication of response. They say encrypted communications traffic has increased substantially in the last several hours. They say there are clear indications of emergency meetings at the highest levels of Russian military command. And they say Putin's decision to escalate now is likely part of a broader strategy intended to test Western limits before the end of the calendar year. But Ukraine is not backing down, despite the devastation. In fact, Ukraine is doubling down on its counteroffensive operations. Their response today, swift, coordinated, and completely unambiguous, sent a clear message to Putin that the cost of escalation will only continue to increase. And it sent an equally important message to the watching world that democracies can still act decisively when faced with authoritarian aggression. As the night goes on, we expect more details to emerge about what exactly Putin hoped to achieve with this latest devastating offensive. But what we do know with certainty is that the American response was timely and substantial. It reassured Ukrainian defenders that they have not been abandoned. It reinforced Allied unity at a moment when cracks were beginning to show. And it demonstrated clearly that the calendar will not determine American commitment to this fight. What happens next will depend largely on what Putin does in the coming days and weeks. If he escalates further, this moment will be remembered as a critical turning point. If he recalculates his strategy, the Biden administration and Ukraine have already shown they are fully prepared for either scenario. They have shown they are ready to respond to whatever comes next. Je stand. And tonight, for the first time in many months, the Kremlin appears to be genuinely reassessing its assumptions. Moscow is quiet. Too quiet. And when Putin is quiet, it means he is calculating his next move carefully. It means he is weighing options he didn't expect to face. Because tonight, Putin learned something he has learned many times before, but seems to keep forgetting. Underestimating Ukraine is a strategic error. Underestimating Western resolve is a strategic error. And underestimating Joe Biden in his final months in office was perhaps his greatest strategic error. This story is far from over, but tonight, one thing is absolutely clear. Zelensky's bold demand was heard in Washington. Biden's surprise response was decisive and comprehensive. And Ukraine once again stands defiant against the darkness.